I'm Dr. Mary DiBartolo, here with Rhonda Evans, a good friend of mine, and actually we were brought together through the experience of Alzheimer's. Because your father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's many years ago, and I invited you to come in to talk about your caregiving experience. We're first going to talk about the symptoms and how that process happened in terms of noticing something wasn't quite right and so forth. So tell us about that.
My father had recently retired after working at a position for 50 years. So initially the first year or so, we thought he was just becoming depressed and lack of interest in things. And then we noticed that he started not wanting to go to social events. And he was always out in the public spotlight and real active in the church, board of directors and all. But he got to the point where he didn't want to go to events or anything like that.
And how old was he when this was all kind of happening?
This was like early, he was 70 maybe,
okay.
69, 70.
And living with your mother, of course.
Living with my mother. And I finally got him to go to a dinner with me, and normally he would be up talking to everybody, and he was just sitting at the table. And I would say...
So very socially withdrawn.
Socially withdrawn.
Not like himself.
He'd speak to someone if they spoke to him, but he wasn't going up and starting a conversation, which I realized later he was probably afraid he wasn't going to remember the name.
Right.
So...
And what about managing the household things that he used to do?
He had always been very good at that until he started forgetting appointments, having trouble telling time, looking at someone asked him what time it was, he could look at a clock and he would just say, I don't know.
And paying the bills and so forth?
Paying the bills became an issue. I was at the house one day and he was writing checks and he was writing the amount on the top line and the person on the second line. So I realized something wasn't right. I said, Dad, that's not correct. You know, so paying the bills, and he was also had trouble with money, counting money and all. I had been with him someplace, and I looked in his wallet. He had all big bills. So when he went to the bank, he would have them give him 20s. So everyone else had to give him change. So he didn't have to think through the process of $12.35. Also, he started wanting to drive less. Yeah, he was still doing some of his driving, but not as much as he had traveled. He was always on the road before. When we did have company or we were out to dinner, conversation-wise, he wasn't his natural self. He may start talking about something and go and talk about another topic in the middle of that.
With the conversation.
He'd lose track of what he was speaking about.
I think you had told me one time he would just leave lots of messages for you on...
Oh, yes.
Back then we had answering machines, or some people still have them, but just leaving repetitive messages on your machine.
I would get home from work and I'd have like 4 or 5 messages from him. He'd left me during the day. It was the exact same message, but it was like 15, 20 minutes apart. So realizing his short-term memory, he wasn't remembering that he had left me the message prior to that. I think
well, that's the thing about Alzheimer's. It's the short-term memory
is what
you really need to function on a day-to-day basis. They can reminisce and remember years ago what happened.
Exactly.
And some people think, well, they mustn't have Alzheimer's. Well, that's because that area of the brain that controls long-term memory is intact for quite some time, but it's the short-term memory that gets you in trouble. Now, I know you said there was one event that you and your sister and your mother looked at each other and said, it's time to take him to the doctor.
He had been on a state commission for 20 years that met bi-monthly, and he had driven to Baltimore all those 20 years and got lost coming home from the meeting. And we had directed him where to go and, to spend the night, and then, because it was a really bad rainstorm. And he had told my sister he was at a Holiday Inn, so when she went the next morning, he wasn't at a Holiday Inn, he was at a truck stop across the street. So he had lost all
orientation of where he was. Yeah.
On his seat, we could see where he had stopped a cop and gotten directions, but just couldn't follow the directions.
Yeah.
So at that point, we realized all the little things that we'd been seeing over the past few years, something major was happening to him.
Well, that's oftentimes what happens because the spouse usually is either in denial. They're seeing it, they live with that person every day, and they're in denial that something seriously could be wrong, especially these days with Alzheimer's, being so prevalent and people are afraid, knowing more about it. Back then, it was a newer type of
thing, yes.
phenomenon, yeah. And also they cover up, right?
My mother would cover for him. I mean, she was to the point where she was bathing him, dressing him, and anybody who walked in would have never known anything was wrong. She was just doing everything for him.
She didn't want you all to know.
No, he didn't realize that she was doing that.
So I know I wanted to chat with you about, I asked you about the fact that he died just 4 years or so later once he was diagnosed. And usually people with Alzheimer's, they say, can live up to 8 to 10 years after diagnosis. But the problem was,
we had symptoms that we had looked at, but not really putting the puzzle together, that had been happening for 4 or 5 years prior to that. And then after the getting lost situation, we had seek medical advice, and they had advised us what to do. And at that point, there wasn't too much to do as far as medication yet, but they directed us as far as assistance. And he was home like another year and a half, and then he was in a nursing home for a year.
Well, if I can share, my mother had Alzheimer's disease, and she's been gone quite some time. But, she lived with my father, 3 kids. All of us lived away and weren't around, every day. And my mother had symptoms, and here I'm a nurse, and I saw these symptoms, but it is hard to come to grips with it, when it's happening to a loved one. And I was noticing things like she'd be sitting there reading the paper and it was upside down. She wrote little notes to herself and stuck them on the different parts of the cabinet around the kitchen to help her navigate around. This is before Post-it notes, so it was pieces of paper with tape. And, she also just lost her social filter. Sometimes she would say things that were just, something she never would say, under normal circumstances. And, she also had a bit of a depression with her. She was very depressed and started isolating herself. And what tipped us off finally is we decided, my parents were older, and we decided to take my father and her to Germany, family trip to Germany. And of course, one of the worst things you can do with a person with dementia is take them out of their familiar element. But back then we were like, let's take, mom and dad on a trip finally. And so we get over there, and one evening we were going out to dinner, and my parents didn't come down to the lobby. So I went upstairs and rapped on the door, and my father said, I don't think we're going. I said, why? She said, she lost her necklace. She had this, it wasn't an expensive necklace, but it was important to her. She couldn't find it. And she had what we used to call a catastrophic reaction, where she just fell to pieces. She had a total meltdown, inconsolable crying about a necklace. And there was no talking her out of it. I said, don't worry about it. Let's just go to dinner. We'll look for the necklace later, And after that happened, we got back home, and I called her physician. I said, I think it's time to have her looked at. It looks like she has, looks to me as if she has Alzheimer's. And it's a tough thing, because I think most people know it's a rough road ahead. And my mother lived about 8 years past her diagnosis, and the only reason she actually had a rare situation where most people will live to the bitter end with Alzheimer's, and she developed a very rare heart valve problem. So she did end up in a nursing home because her care got to be too much for my father. And in the nursing home, she was diagnosed with this problem and basically just died in her sleep and didn't make it to the bitter end, which in a way was merciful to me, that my father didn't have to go through all that, where she wouldn't know who he was one day and that kind of thing. But it's a tough road, and I know, I will say, I just have to commend you on something, is that they say when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. And, you just had this experience of Alzheimer's back when we didn't know a lot about it. And after your father passed, you went ahead and turned around and started a local chapter of the Alzheimer's Association, and just did so much for our local community in terms of getting the word out about this disease. and education and support. And I've always admired you so much for that. And that's how we became friends,
yes,
through the
yeah.
Alzheimer's Association volunteer work.
I thought when I started seeing if we could get the association locally, I just thought if I could help one family not have to go through what we went through, because there wasn't as many resources available, and you feel like you're by yourself until you talk to someone else that's gone through it.
Well, Rhonda, the good news is things have come a long way since you and I were dealing with parents with Alzheimer's, in that we now have the Alzheimer's Association, which you were very active in, as was I, in getting the word out. Because I think once people have that caregiver experience, you want to help other people.
Yes.
You have a special empathy for people in that role. But the good news is we also have dementia clinics or trained neurologists or dementia specialists. So if you suspect any of these warning signs of Alzheimer's, you can take them to a trained person who can do a comprehensive workup and at least let you know what you're dealing with.
Yes, 'cause before we didn't have that opportunity to be able to do that. The Alzheimer's Association actually has a flyer that has the 10 warning signs that you can, and it says if you have one or more of several of these, to contact your local physician and have an evaluation. So.
And we'll talk about the Alzheimer's Association more in our next segment, which is more on the caregiver experience and resources. But I think we both agree that it's never good news to get an Alzheimer's diagnosis, but at least you can know what you're dealing with, and not feel that uncertainty of what's going on, what can I do? And there's so much more information out now that can help you with care techniques and communication strategies and that kind of thing. So we're moving along, just need a treatment or cure. But
yes.
In the meantime, we do have resources for better care and support. So we'll be talking more about the dementia caregiving experience and the resources in the next segment.